Hello, and welcome to The Brief Insight, your go to podcast for breaking down the latest trends, research, and policies shaping our world. Whether you're passionate about sustainability, global economics, or emerging innovations, this is where we simplify complex ideas to keep you informed and inspired. If you enjoy what you hear, don't forget to like this episode, subscribe to our channel, and share it with anyone looking for insights that matter. We're here every Monday and Friday, so hit that notification bell to stay updated. Your support helps us grow and continue bringing you sharp, relevant content that sparks conversation. Thank you for tuning into The Brief Insight. Now let's dive into today's topic.
So imagine you live in a country that's spent well over a decade just absolutely crippled by daily power blackouts.
Right, and we aren't talking about, a flickering light here and there during a storm.
No, exactly. We're talking about a situation so incredibly dire that at any given time, like nearly half of the country's power plants were just entirely offline.
Which means businesses shutting down, traffic lights going completely dark.
Yes, citizens basically scheduling their entire lives around this mobile app that tells them exactly when the grid is going to be switched off.
Right, what they call load shedding.
Exactly, load shedding. Now, imagine that exact same country suddenly achieving what economists are calling a slender excess of electricity.
It's wild.
It is, going over 300 consecutive days without a single planned blackout. And this is the kicker, they pulled this off without building any massive new state infrastructure.
Yeah, it fundamentally rewrites a lot of the conventional wisdom we have about how a nation actually solves an infrastructure crisis of that magnitude.
Because it was bad.
Oh, you were looking at a system that was effectively in a death spiral. And the turnaround was achieved through this very specific blend of severe operational discipline and the sudden unleashing of private capital.
And that is exactly what we are dissecting today in this deep dive. We're looking at South Africa and how they managed to seemingly perform this energy miracle.
To finally end the load shedding.
Right. And to figure out how this happened, we're pulling from a pretty diverse stack of materials today. We've got Nedbank's sober financial reports, Eskom's own internal blueprints, raw data from the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, and some legal analyses of the new energy frameworks from Weber Wentzel.
And honestly, the overarching narrative across all these sources is pretty striking.
Yeah,
it's a perfect case study of what happens when a government is finally forced, with its back totally against the wall, to just stop bailing out of failing utility monopoly.
it just gets out of the way.
Exactly. They get out of the way so the private sector can actually step in.
Well, because to really understand how South Africa achieved this sudden excess of power, we first have to look at how they stopped the bleeding at Eskom.
Right, the state-owned monopoly.
Yeah, the massive utility that has basically run their grid for a century. And things were historically bad. The core metric here is the energy availability factor, or EAF.
Which just measures the actual real-time capability of the power plants to generate electricity.
Right. And by 2023, Eskom's EAF had plummeted to 55%.
Mechanically speaking, that means almost half of their generation fleet is either completely broken or undergoing unplanned maintenance at any given moment.
Which is terrifying for a national grid.
Totally. And to keep the lights on even partially, Eskom was doing the equivalent of heating a house by burning all the expensive furniture.
Oh, wow.
They were relying incredibly heavily on diesel-fueled open-cycle gas turbines, the OCGTs.
Right, and just to picture this for you listening, an OCGT is essentially a massive jet engine that's just bolted to the ground. It's designed to be fired up for maybe an hour or two during absolute peak emergencies, right? Like when the grid needs a quick injection of power. But Eskom was running these things around the clock.
Which is just financially ruinous. Historically, the government's response to this was simply to absorb the cost.
Just keep handing out bailouts.
Right. So Eskom could just go buy more diesel. But then in 2023, the government completely shifted its strategy through the Eskom Debt Relief Act.
Okay, let's unpack this because this is huge.
Yeah, they took on 254 billion South African rand of Eskom's debt. That is roughly 15 billion US dollars.
But the crucial part of that $15 billion bailout was the conditions attached to it, right?
Yes.
The government takes this massive debt off Eskom's books, but strictly blocks them from borrowing any more money and explicitly forbids them from building any new generation projects.
Which is a massive paradigm shift.
It's like taking a teenager's maxed out credit card away. You pay off the debt they racked up buying, parts for some fantasy sports car, but you lock them in the garage and refuse to let them out until they actually fix the broken down jalopy they already own.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And Eskom had no choice but to follow that mandate. So they instituted what they called the Generation Recovery Plan,
Right.
which was a total pivot away from expansion and purely toward the intensive maintenance of their existing coal fleet.
To jalopy.
Exactly. They focused on priority stations, like the massive Kusile power plant, which actually had units completely offline due to a flue duct collapse.
Right. And for context, the flue duct is essentially the massive exhaust pipe that safely vents out all the toxic gases and ash from burning coal.
Yeah, it's a huge structural component.
So when that structural integrity fails and the duct collapses, you have to shut down the entire generation unit for environmental and safety reasons. You can't just put some duct tape on it overnight.
Right. Bringing those units back online required meticulous, sustained engineering work.
I think one official in the sources described it as opening a car's bonnet and checking every single plug, every motor, the starter.
Yeah, you have to accept the short-term pain of having the plant offline to achieve the long-term gain of a stable unit. And honestly, that operational discipline paid off.
It really did.
By focusing entirely on what they could control, Eskom managed to restore 5,506 megawatts of capacity within a year.
Wow.
Yeah, so their EAF bumped up from 55% to 60%. And because the baseload coal plants were working better, their emergency diesel usage plummeted by 59%.
Saving them, 9 billion rand?
Exactly. 9 billion rand saved.
Which is just an incredible display of operational turnaround. But stabilizing the old coal plants only explains part of this excess power, right?
Yeah, the supply went up slightly.
Right, but the massive gap between supply and demand actually closed because the demand side of the equation fundamentally fractured.
This is where the story shifts entirely from engineering to macroeconomics.
Yep.
Because the CSIR and Nedbank data reveal this massive anomaly. In 2024, the demand for Eskom's electricity dropped by an average of 3%.
Which doesn't sound like a lot, but...
Oh, in a developing economy, a 3% drop in core energy demand is staggering.
Wait, okay, looking at the Nedbank report, though, I'm not sure we should be celebrating this excess just yet.
How so?
Well, they point out that poor economic growth is keeping demand artificially low, right? Like, if the South African economy were actually booming right now, if factories were running at a 100% capacity, wouldn't this slender excess just instantly vanish?
It is absolutely a factor. I mean, you cannot decouple the electricity crisis from South Africa's economic stagnation.
Right.
The sheer lack of reliable power severely capped their economic growth for a decade. So yes, part of the reason demand dropped is cyclical. The economy has just been sluggish.
Okay.
However, the data shows a much larger structural shift taking place too. The demand didn't just vanish into thin air, it moved to the rooftops.
Oh, right. Because for years, the South African government strictly capped how much electricity private companies could generate for themselves.
It was incredibly restrictive.
Yeah, it was capped at just 1 megawatt. If you ran a factory, a 1 megawatt solar installation barely covers your lighting and maybe some basic office functions.
It definitely doesn't run heavy industrial machinery.
Right. And building anything larger required this incredibly complex licensing process that was basically designed to protect Eskom's monopoly.
But as the load shedding crisis deepened, the government was politically and economically forced to yield.
They had to.
Yeah. First, they raised the cap to 100 megawatts in 2021. And then they just removed the cap entirely.
Wow.
No massive licensing requirements for private generation projects. And the moment they removed that artificial ceiling, the private sector moved with astonishing speed.
I mean, companies no longer needed complex sovereign guarantees or years of bureaucratic approvals.
Right. They just went to domestic banks, secured financing, and started building.
And the numbers are just wild. Within 18 months of removing those caps, companies and households built 5,000 megawatts of solar capacity.
5,000 in just 18 months.
Yeah, with another 12,000 megawatts in the pipeline right now. Plus, the government scaled up the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program.
It's a mouthful, but yeah.
Very long name. But it allowed private developers to bid to build massive utility-scale projects, completely bypassing Eskom's balance sheet. And that brought in 200 billion rand in private investment.
Which fundamentally alters Eskom's business model forever.
How so?
Well, they're suddenly looking at a landscape where their biggest, most reliable commercial customers, the mines, the factories, the large agricultural operations, they're generating their own power.
Oh, right.
That is the invisible power plant that helped solve the crisis. And getting back to the Nedbank growth concerns, this structural shift to self-generation is permanent.
Because those businesses aren't going to dismantle their solar arrays if the economy booms.
Exactly. In fact, restored confidence in the power supply is already having a macroeconomic effect. GDP growth forecasts are climbing from a projected 1.3% in 2025 up to nearly 2% for 2027.
So the foundation is infinitely more resilient now because it's distributed.
Precisely.
But, I mean, Eskom losing 20% of its market share over the last decade means the monopoly is going to put up a fight.
Oh, absolutely.
Because while the physical infrastructure of the grid changed, the laws had to be rewritten to accommodate this new free market. Here's where it gets really interesting.
It's quite the saga.
You have this century-old monopoly watching its customers build their own power plants, and now the government is telling Eskom it has to unbundle. It has to split into 3 separate entities.
Generation, transmission, and distribution.
Right.
Which is standard practice for creating a competitive energy market anywhere. I mean, you cannot have the company that generates the power also own the transmission lines.
The sole highway that delivers the power.
Exactly. Because if they own the highway, they have every incentive to prevent competitors' power from traveling on it.
Right. It's like watching Blockbuster Video trying to buy up all the internet cables in your neighborhood just to throttle your Netflix stream.
That is exactly what it's like.
So to stop that, the government established the National Transmission Company of South Africa, the NTCSA. And the end goal is a competitive market by 2030, where surviving Eskom power plants have to actively compete with private renewable suppliers to sell power.
And this relies heavily on a mechanism called wheeling.
Wheeling. Okay, explain that.
Wheeling is crucial to understand here. It is the physical and financial act of transporting electricity from a private generator to a private buyer over the state-owned grid.
Okay.
So if a company builds a massive solar farm in the sunny Northern Cape, they need to wheel that power across Eskom's transmission lines to sell it to a factory in Johannesburg.
Got it. They pay a toll to use the lines, but the transaction is entirely private.
Exactly.
But Eskom actively resisted giving up that highway, didn't they?
Oh, they fought it tooth and nail. In late 2023, they proposed a revised unbundling plan where they would magically retain ownership of all the transmission infrastructure.
Of course they did.
The Eskom board chairperson even publicly insisted they should be compensated for the transmission assets they were transferring to the new state-owned entity.
Compensated. They're both owned by the state. I mean, President Ramaphosa literally had to use his State of the Nation address to publicly overrule them and confirm the independent transmission company would take control.
Yeah. And the legal analysis from the TRALAC Trade Law Center highlights just how hard Eskom fought to maintain its grip. They used every administrative lever available.
Yeah.
They even went to court to try and stop the licensing of 4 new private electricity traders.
Why?
Arguing that these traders would cherry-pick the best, most profitable customers.
Which is the literal definition of market competition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they lost that case.
Naturally.
They also lost a case against a mining company, Sibeni-Stillwater, where Eskom trying to block the mine from accessing a substation to wheel their own private power, allegedly because Eskom didn't want to lose the revenue.
That's crazy.
They even went all the way to the Supreme Court of Appeal to try and keep their 70 billion rand coal and diesel contracts completely secret.
Wait, secret? While spending taxpayer money?
Yes, claiming commercial confidentiality.
And let me guess, they lost that one too.
They lost that one too.
Wow. But Eskom losing court cases doesn't automatically mean the free market has won.
Not at all.
Because while the physical monopoly is breaking down, the state has quietly built a brand new legal maze to manage it. The analysis from the law firm Weber Wenzel on the new Electricity Regulation Amendment Act, the ERAA, it reveals some incredibly complex contradictions.
Yeah, this act just took effect in January 2025.
Right, and on paper, it's the framework for this new open market. But right out of the gate, we have to look at how power is priced.
It gets very bureaucratic.
Very. Under the new law, the energy regulator, NERSA, still retains the power to approve prices and tariffs.
Right.
There is an exception carved out for direct supply agreements. In those cases, a willing buyer and a willing seller can just agree on a price, and NERSA doesn't have to approve it.
But the bottleneck arises from the legal definitions. Power purchase agreements.
Yeah.
In the long-term contracts between private generators and private electricity traders, those are not legally considered direct supply agreements under the current reading.
Ah.
So if a consortium builds a wind farm and wants to sell that power to an independent trader who then plans to wheel it to various factories, Nurses still have to step in and approve the tariff for that initial sale.
Which completely stalls the entire willing buyer, willing seller dynamic. You establish a free market on paper, but force all the private trades right back into a bureaucratic bottleneck.
Exactly. And it goes deeper than pricing, too.
Mm-hmm.
The ERA also grants the Minister of Electricity and Energy these sweeping, unprecedented discretionary powers. Well, historically, the country relies on the Integrated Resource Plan, the IRP, which is a heavily researched long-term national roadmap that dictates exactly what mix of energy the country needs to build.
Right, so many gigawatts of wind, so many of gas, etc.
Exactly. But under the new law, the minister can completely deviate from that roadmap if they declare a market failure or an emergency.
And the previous safeguard, the requirement that any new generation capacity authorized by the minister actually had to go through a fair competitive tender process, that was completely stripped out of the new law.
Yes, it was.
So the minister effectively has a blank check. And the wildest legal nuance from the Weber-Wentzel piece is that the minister can execute these deviations, quote, after consultation with the regulator and the finance minister.
And this is a massive distinction in South African administrative law.
Yeah.
If a statute says a minister must act in consultation with another body, it means they must reach an agreement. They need consensus.
Right.
But if it says after consultation, it legally means the minister simply has to ask for their input. They are completely free to ignore the advice and do whatever they want.
So what does this all mean for you listening? I mean, we established a free market, but gave the minister a blank check to override it after consultation, which legally means they don't even have to agree, and we bottlenecked private trades with regulatory approvals.
It's a mess.
It sounds like we just swapped a physical engineering problem for a legal bureaucracy problem.
Weber-Wentzel predicts the courts are going to be overwhelmed over the next few years as the private sector sues to limit the minister's power and force the actual implementation of the open market.
And even if you navigate that legal maze, you still hit a physical wall.
The actual transmission grid.
Right. It's completely bottlenecked in the Cape provinces.
Yeah, this is a huge geographical mismatch.
Exactly. Historically, South Africa's grid was built to transport power from the massive coal fields in the northeast, right down to the rest of the country. But today, the best wind and solar resources are in the south and west, the Cape provinces.
And those physical transmission lines are just maxed out. I mean, you can have all the permits in the world, but you physically cannot plug a new solar farm into the grid down there because the wires cannot carry another electron.
It's wild. And adding to this friction is the existential crisis facing local municipalities.
This is maybe the most complicated part.
Yeah, local governments own about half of the distribution grid in South Africa. Their entire funding model is based on buying bulk electricity from Eskom, marking up the price, and then selling it to residents.
Right, and the profit margin on that electricity is what funds city operations. Streetlights, trash collection, road maintenance.
And LGA, the South African Local Government Association, is fighting this new Free Market Act tooth and nail. Because if wealthy consumers and large businesses are generating their own power or buying it directly from private traders via wheeling, the municipalities lose their primary source of revenue.
The cross-subsidy that pays for everything else just collapses.
Exactly.
It is a massive structural flaw. I mean, these municipalities currently owe Eskom over 95 billion rand in unpaid debt.
95 billion?
Yes. If their core revenue stream evaporates because of the transition to private solar, they will default on that massive debt, and that could severely destabilize the newly unbundled generation and transmission companies.
So it's an incredibly precarious balancing act. To pull all these threads together, South Africa, a country defined for over a decade by the rolling blackouts of load shedding, manages to reach over 300 days of stable power.
Yep.
They achieved this by forcing severe operational discipline on a failing utility bumping plant availability from 55% to 60% by essentially fixing the broken exhaust pipes and engines they already owned.
And simultaneously, they removed the licensing caps that protected the monopoly.
Right. Unleashing 200 billion rand in private investment and letting the free market build 5,000 megawatts of its own capacity.
The broader implication here is really profound.
Yeah.
If you are examining struggling public infrastructure anywhere in the world, this proves that the solution isn't always a massive, debt-fueled government mega project.
Sometimes you don't need a new dam.
No. Sometimes the most effective policy is simply to enforce basic, rigorous maintenance on existing assets. And crucially, to dismantle the regulatory red tape that prevents private capital and innovation from solving the problem for you.
It is a phenomenal lesson in both statecraft and economics, but we want to leave you with a final, slightly provocative thought drawn from the sources, because this story isn't over.
Not by a long shot.
Over the coming decade, Eskom is actually scheduled to decommission several of those massive legacy coal plants. They are reaching the absolute end of their engineering design life.
Right, and no amount of maintenance can keep them running safely forever.
Exactly. Concurrently, the research indicates there is a potential 10 gigawatts of residential and commercial rooftop solar capacity just waiting to be unlocked by 2030.
Provided the grid and the legal frameworks can actually accommodate it.
Exactly. So the question is this. As those old coal dinosaurs are finally put to rest and the physical supply of state-generated power inevitably drops again, will the citizen-powered solar revolution be allowed to step up fast enough to fill the void?
Or is this current slender excess just a temporary calm before a new kind of storm?
Right. Imagine that country again. The one crippled by blackouts. Only this time, when the sun sets, the lights don't stay on because of a giant, distant coal plant. They stay on because of millions of invisible power plants on the roofs of its citizens. The grid of the future isn't a straight line anymore, it's a web.
We'll see if South Africa can finish weaving it.